What were the main results of the 7 Weeks' War? Bismarck returned to Berlin with the king and Moltke to a hero's welcome. A grateful Prussia presented him with a reward of £60,000, with which he bought an estate in Pomerania. He was promoted to Major General in honor of the victory. It had been noticeable that in meetings of the War Cabinet he had been the only one present wearing civilian clothes. Any officer he was then entitled to would have marked him as an officer of lower rank than anyone else there, and he could not have borne that. Now he was a high-ranking officer, he could flaunt his uniform on an equal footing, and he never again appeared in public except in full military dress. He had earned his spurs and intended to wear them in a Prussia and later a Germany dominated by military power. The road to Vienna lay open after the victory at Sandoa. Austria was at the mercy of Prussia. Wilhelm I, once reluctant to wage war on a fellow German monarch, now proposed an advance on Vienna and a takeover of Austria. Bismarck, fearful that France and Russia might intervene, counseled caution. He wrote to William, "We have to avoid wounding Austria too severely." At a noisy and angry meeting of the War Cabinet on the 23rd of July, Wilhelm I and his senior generals raged against Bismarck's policy of not annexing any Austrian territory, while Bismarck himself dramatically threatened suicide if his advice was not taken. In the end, Bismarck got his way. The war was brought to a speedy end, and a moderate peace concluded with Austria. The only territory lost by Austria as a result of the 7 Weeks' War was Venetia in Italy. An armistice was signed between Prussia and Austria in July. This was followed by the Treaty of Prague in August. The terms of the treaty were mainly concerned with remodeling of northern Germany. Prussia annexed a good deal of territory, including Schleswig and Holstein, Hesse-Kassel, Hanover, Nassau, and even Frankfurt. All other German states north of the River Main, including Saxony, were to be formed into a North German Confederation under Prussian leadership. Bismarck might have pressed for unification of all of Germany in 1866. However, as well as the threat of French intervention, he feared that if Prussia absorbed too much too soon, this might be more trouble than it was worth. The 4 Catholic states south of the River Main, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt, thus retained their independence. Nevertheless, all 4 states agreed to sign a secret military alliance with Prussia, whereby, in the event of war, they would not only fight alongside Prussia, but also put their armies under the command of the King of Prussia. The Treaty of Prague is usually seen as a milestone on the way to German unity. Ironically, the destruction of the German Confederation could be seen as dividing rather than uniting Germany. After 1866, Germans were separated into 3 distinct units: the North German Confederation, the 4 South German states, and the Austrian Empire. Bismarck had shown a calculated moderation in his treatment of Austria. He showed neither of those to some of his fellow North Germans. Hesse-Kassel, Nassau, Hanover, Frankfurt, and Schleswig-Holstein were not consulted about uniting with Prussia. They were just annexed. The King of Hanover was driven out and his personal fortune confiscated. It came in useful to Bismarck later, when it was used to bribe the King of Bavaria. Those North German states, such as Saxony, not annexed by Prussia, were left with some independence within the North German Confederation. Some historians have seen this as a trial run by Bismarck in North Germany for an eventual wider federation taking all of Little Germany. They argue that he could have easily annexed the remaining northern states if he had so wished, but did not do so because he wanted to show the Germans south of the Main how great membership of the Prussian-controlled Federation could be. A more credible argument is that Bismarck saw no advantage to Prussia in too speedy a takeover of so many states at once. Such an action would only lead to a dilution of Prussian culture and traditions. Instead of Prussia absorbing Germany, Germany would end up absorbing Prussia. At the end of 1866, Bismarck began drafting the Constitution for the North German Confederation. This was accepted by April 1867 and came into effect in July. The Confederation lasted only 4 years, but its constitution was to continue, largely unaltered, as the Constitution of the German Empire. It was designed to fit the requirements of Prussian power and Bismarck's own political position. Bismarck was always opposed to the idea of parliamentary government on the British model, which reduced the crown to symbolic status and put power in the hands of Parliament. His declared view of the political abilities of his fellow Germans was low. He said, considering the political incapacity of the average German, the parliamentary system would lead to conditions such as prevailed in 1848. That is to say, weakness and incompetence at the top and ever new demands from below. The King of Prussia was president of the North German Confederation and also the commander-in-chief, and had the power of declaring war and making peace. He appointed and could dismiss the federal chancellor. The states, including Prussia, had substantial rights, keeping their own rulers and being governed by their own laws and constitutions with their own parliamentary assemblies. They had their own legal and administration systems, and local taxation met the cost of government services. The Federal Council was the upper house of the Confederation's parliament. Here, the various states were represented by delegates who acted on the instruction of their governments. The number of delegates was fixed in relation to the size of the state. Out of 43 votes, Prussia had 17, Saxony 4. Most of the others each had 1. Decisions were made by a simple majority vote. The Reichstag was the lower house of the Confederacy's parliament. It was elected by universal manhood suffrage, a seemingly giant step towards democracy. However, its powers were limited. The federal chancellor or chief minister was the main driving force in the Confederation. He represented the Prussian king in the Bundesrat. He was not responsible to the Reichstag, nor did he need majority support in it. He was responsible only to the President of the Confederation. All laws needed approval of the Reichstag and the Bundesrat and the King of Prussia as President of the Confederation. They also needed the signature of the Chancellor. Given his views, Bismarck's insistence on universal manhood suffrage in the election of the Reichstag is surprising. However, he believed that the traditional loyalties of the peasants would preserve the conservative order in Germany, nor did he intend the Reichstag to play a significant part in public life. Essentially, it was little more than an organ of political opinion. Speaking in confidence to a Saxon minister, he declared he was trying to destroy parliamentarianism by parliamentarianism. In effect, he hoped that the activities of a weak Reichstag would help to discredit parliamentary institution in Germans' eyes. Certainly, the democratic manner of the election process did not compensate for the great weakness of the Reichstag, which was that ministers, including the Chancellor, were not members of it and were not responsible to it. On the same day as the Battle of Sadowa, elections were held in Prussia. Patriotic war fever resulted in a big increase in the number of conservatives elected to the Prussian Parliament. The numbers jumped from 34 to 142, while the liberal parties were reduced from 253 to 148. Moreover, after Prussia's victory, many liberals changed their attitude to Bismarck. He was now acclaimed rather than maligned. This ensured an era of harmony between Bismarck and the Prussian Parliament. Both the left and the right-wing parties in Parliament split into new groupings. A large section of the old Liberal Party formed themselves into the National Liberal Party, pledged to support Bismarck and his nationalist policy, but equally pledged to maintain liberal constitutional principles against any government attempt to undermine them. On the right, the Junker Party opposed Bismarck as a traitor to his class, whittling away at the royal prerogative and losing Prussia's identity in the new unified North Germany. Moderate conservatives formed a new party, the Free Conservatives. They, together with the National Liberals, were to provide the support that Bismarck needed to carry out his policies. The first Reichstag was elected in February 1867. The National Liberals were the largest single party in it and held the balance of power between Bismarck's conservative supporters and his various opponents. They were able to win a number of concessions from Bismarck, now the federal chancellor. Those included the right to pass an annual budget. This financial control was very limited because it did not include control over the military budget, which accounted for about 90% of the Confederation's spending. The Liberals and Bismarck struggled over the question of the military budget and eventually reached a compromise. It would remain outside the Reichstag's control for 5 years until 1872. Then the amount of money to be spent on the army would be fixed by law, and for this the Reichstag's consent would be required. Generally prepared to support Bismarck's policies, the Reichstag carried through an ambitious legislative program, including a range of unifying measures. The Treaty of Prague brought huge gains to Prussia. Austria was now forced to withdraw from German affairs, leaving the field clear for Prussian influence to dominate. Two-thirds of all Germans, excluding German Austrians, were now part of the Prussian-dominated North German Confederation. Most North Germans quickly accepted the situation. For many liberal nationalists, there was no reconcilable differences between Bismarck's Prussian policy and Little Germany nationalism. Unification was happening, even if it was being carried out by force, and some liberals believed that the end justified the means. Indeed, after 1866, Bismarck found himself under nationalist pressure, North and South, to complete the process of unification. Recognizing that union with the southern states would strengthen Prussia in relation to both France and Austria, Bismarck, not averse to the idea, was prepared to use rhetoric and emotion of German nationalism to help bring it about. In 1866, the tide in South Germany in favor of union with the North seemed to be flowing strongly. Political parties were established in the southern states to work for unity. In 1867, the 4 southern states were incorporated into a new Zollparlament, a parliament elected to discuss the policy of the Zollverein. This was intended to encourage closer cooperation between North and South. However, by 1867, local loyalties in the South reemerged. Many Southern Catholics regarded Prussians with suspicion. The foreign minister of Baden described the North German Confederation as a union of a dog with its fleas. In 1868, the Southern states elected a majority of delegates, 49 to 35, to the Zoll Parliament opposed to union with the North. National liberals who hoped that the Zoll Parliament would be a motor for national unification were bitterly disappointed. Bismarck was not too concerned. He believed that in good time, whether by war or simply as a result of evolution, the southern states would fall like ripe fruit into Prussia's basket. Another key question is what factors helped Bismarck towards the road to unification? In 1869, Bismarck wrote, "I am not so arrogant as to assume that the likes of us are able to make history. My task is to keep an eye on the currents of the latter and steer my ship in them as best as I can." And he steered brilliantly. However, a variety of factors enabled him to bring about German unification. German unification was the immediate result of three short wars against Denmark in 1864 and Austria in 1866 and France in 1870 and 71. The Prussian army thus made Germany a reality. The fighting capacity of the Prussian army improved immensely in the early 1860s, thanks to the efforts and ability of War Minister Roon and General Moltke, chief of the General Staff. Roon ensured that Prussian forces were increased, better trained, and well armed. Under Moltke, the General Staff became the brains of the Prussian army, laying plans for mobilization and military operations. In particular, Prussian military chiefs were quick to see the potential of railroads for the rapid movement of troops. Prussian economic growth in the 1850s and 1860s outstripped that of Austria and France. By mid-1860s, Prussia produced more coal and steel than France or Austria and had more extensive railway networks. In 1865, it possessed 15,000 steam engines with a total horsepower of 800,000. Austria, by contrast, had 3,400 steam engines with a total horsepower of 100,000. The economic and financial strength of Prussia gave the military resources it needed to challenge first Austria and then France. A key industrialist was Alfred Krupp, whose iron foundries in the Ruhr produced high-quality armaments. The continued spread of the railway and the growth of an increasingly complex financial and commercial network helped to draw all parts of Germany into closer economic union. So did the Prussian-dominated Zollverein, which by 1864 included virtually every German state except Austria. However, while the Zollverein ensured that Prussia had considerable economic influence in Germany, this was not translated into political domination. Many German states supported Austria politically to counterbalance economic power to Prussia. In 1866, most Zollverein states allied with Austria against Prussia. The failure of the 1848 revolution was a serious blow to German nationalism. However, the idea of a unified state persisted in the hearts and minds of liberal nationalists. In September 1859, the National Association was formed. Stimulated by the success of Italian nationalism, it promoted the idea that Prussia should lead the German cause, as the state of Piedmont had led the cause of Italian nationalism, and become more liberal in outlook. But gone was the romantic idealism of 1848. Many nationalists now accepted that nothing could be achieved without power. Only Prussia seemed to have that power. At its peak, the National Association had 25,000 members. However, it included many influential men and had close links with a range of other organizations, not least with the liberal parties that won growing support in many states, including Prussia, in the early 1860s. There is no doubt that nationalist sentiment was strong among middle-class Germans who, as a result of industrialization, were growing in economic and social power. The middle classes tend to lead public opinion. Books and newspapers supported the idea of national unity. Moreover, fears of French expansion were still prevalent. Popular nationalism, strongest in the Protestant North, was a force that could not be ignored by Bismarck. However, there is plenty of evidence to suggest that many Germans had little interest in national unity. There was certainly no massive sentiment in favor of a Prussian-dominated Germany. Austria was a power in decline after 1848 and 49. The Austrian economy was largely agricultural, with pockets of industry confined largely to the western regions. Austria also faced the growing problem of minority nationalism, especially in Italy. Austria had mounting financial problems. The Crimean War had weakened Austria's diplomatic position, and defeat in the North Italian War in 1859 was a serious blow to Austrian prestige. Austrian leaders also displayed a lack of political and diplomatic skill. The fact that Prussia was regarded as a second-rate power in 1862 helped Bismarck. He was able to achieve supremacy in Germany without arousing the hostility of Prussia's neighbors. In 1860s, Britain adopted a non-interventionist posture towards continental affairs. The prevailing view was that Britain had nothing to fear from Protestant Prussia, and that a strong Germany would be a useful bulwark against France or Russia. Also, Russia, concerned with reform at home, showed little interest in Central Europe. Its sympathies lie with Prussia. Russia had still not forgiven Austria for its policy during the Crimean War. After the failure of the 1848 and 49 revolutions, it seemed that Austrian power had revived. Austrian policy was still based on dominating Germany by keeping it weak and divided. Thus, Germany would only be unified once Austrian strength had been broken. The only country that could do that was Prussia. In the 1850s, Prussia was regarded as the least important of the major powers, but appearances were deceptive. In 1862, Otto von Bismarck was appointed Minister-President of Prussia. 4 years later, Prussia smashed Austria in the Seven Weeks' War and established the North German Confederation.